What's the largest muscle in the upper body? Many people would say it's the chest or the pectoralis major. However, when we average the results from 10 studies measuring human muscle size, it shows that the shoulder, specifically the deltoid, possesses the greatest volume in the upper body. The deltoid was the largest at 376 cubic centimeters, while the chest, triceps, lats, and traps were all similarly around 200 cubic centimeters. For reference, the biceps is said to be the smallest upper body muscle at 112. Besides its absolute size, the shoulder is also a very important muscle for your appearance. When you look at the silhouette of the upper body, the muscle that defines the outer shape is the deltoid, and it plays a crucial role in creating that V-taper shape that emphasizes masculinity. It's not for nothing that they say broad shoulders are a man's pride. In this video, I'll explain how you can best optimize your shoulder workouts. We don't state the obvious here. Most shoulder videos you find on YouTube usually go something like this. Shoulders are split into front, side, and rear. For front delts, do heavy presses. For side delts, focus on stimulating lateral raises, and don't forget rear delts, hit them with reverse pec deck flies. Instead of such obvious content, I will only deliver information that you are truly missing or that can definitely help you. If your shoulders aren't growing effectively, please check your workout order. When you go to the gym, are you doing your shoulder exercises first? Let's assume you're following a 3-day split routine. On push day, if you prioritize chest exercises such as bench press, pec deck fly, and incline press, and then follow up with shoulder workouts, your shoulder growth will likely be hindered. A 2021 meta-analysis showed that the exercises performed first had the fastest strength gains. This meta-analysis combined the results of 8 different studies. If the study's ES value is positive, meaning it's to the right, then the strength increase for the exercise done first was faster. If it's negative, the strength increase for the exercise done first was slower. If the value is 0, it means exercise order and strength are unrelated. Among the 8 studies, 6 showed a clear positive ES value. The 2 studies that showed negative values were not significantly large and were close to 0. When analyzing all the results together, it's evident that the exercise performed initially leads to the most rapid increase in strength. So if you do the bench press, then the overhead press, your bench press weight will increase faster. But if you do the overhead press first, then the bench press, your overhead press weight will increase faster. Are your shoulders the muscle group you want to focus on right now? If so, I recommend doing your shoulder exercises first during your upper body workout. That's it for exercise order. Let's move on to specific types of exercises. Shoulder workouts consist of vertical presses to lift upward and lateral raises to lift sideways. Let's take a closer look at each exercise. First, let's look at the lateral raise. The lateral raise is an isolation exercise with a low fatigue burden, so you can handle a high volume of exercise without systemic fatigue or local fatigue, including in the joints. However, I personally don't think the dumbbell lateral raise is an optimal movement for muscle hypertrophy. What's lacking in the dumbbell lateral raise? The answer can be found in the muscle's length. Those of you who watched our previous video will know that muscles grow best when they are stretched, that is, when they are at their longest. As of January 2024, a remarkable 25 studies support the claim that muscles show much faster muscle growth when they are in a lengthened position. Feel free to pause the video and take a look. A prime example is a study comparing the neutral pushdown and overhead extension. The extension, which stretches the long head more, led to 1.5 times greater triceps growth. In a study comparing the seated hamstring curl and the lying hamstring curl, a 50% greater change in muscle mass was observed in the seated curl where the hamstring is more stretched. Now let's get back to shoulders. The lateral raise doesn't stretch the deltoid well. Looking at the shoulder, the deltoid's length varies with arm height. When the arm is down, the deltoid is at its maximum stretch, but as you raise the arm, the muscle contracts and gets shorter. So the bottom of the movement with the arm down is best for muscle hypertrophy. So to maximize muscle hypertrophy, you should emphasize the bottom portion of the movement where the muscle is lengthened and de-emphasize the top portion where the muscle is shortened. However, the lateral raise does the complete opposite. When performing the lateral raise, when do the dumbbells feel heaviest? When you raise your arm to 90 degrees parallel to the ground, the moment arm is maximized, making the torque from gravity the greatest. But this is when the deltoid is contracted and shortened. Conversely, when the arm is down and the deltoid is most stretched, the moment arm is very small, so there's virtually no resistance felt by the deltoid from gravity. It's completely backward. When the muscle is at its most extended length, there's minimal resistance applied, and conversely, when the muscle is at its shortest, it experiences the most resistance. How can this be corrected? The primary issue with the dumbbell lateral raise lies in the direction of gravity. Because gravity only acts downward, it's hard to target the muscle in its most stretched position. If we could change the direction of resistance from downward to sideways, we could apply plenty of resistance to the deltoid even when the arm is close to the torso. The answer is the cable lateral raise. The biggest advantage of the cable is that you can freely change the direction of the resistance. Dumbbells offer only downward resistance, but cables, if positioned well, can provide sideways resistance. If you set the cable 3 notches higher, performing a lateral raise will maximize resistance when your arm is against your body and your deltoid is most stretched. The higher you raise your arm, the shorter the movement arm becomes, reducing the resistance. Therefore, less load is applied when the muscle is in a shortened state. If that's hard to grasp, just think the resistance is greatest when your arm and the cable form a 90-degree angle, and it lessens as you move away from that. Now, a very desirable situation has been created. The most resistance is applied when the deltoid is stretched, and the least amount of resistance is applied when it is shortened. If the cable is fixed and you can't raise the height, you can lean your torso to create a similar situation. When the cable is low like this, there's not much resistance on the deltoid because the cable is pulling in the same direction as your arm. But if you lean your torso toward the cable, your arm is still next to your body, but now there's resistance on the deltoid. Before, the angle between the arm and the cable was greater than 90 degrees, but now you can see it's closer to 90. What if your gym doesn't have a cable machine? Well, you can create a similar situation with dumbbells. If you stand upright, there's no resistance at the bottom, but leaning your torso creates resistance from gravity. You can do this by placing a hand on the wall or leaning on an incline bench, as this person is doing. Ultimately, the weight profile of these movements completely inverts the resistance profile of a standard dumbbell raise. This is very advantageous for muscle hypertrophy because the most resistance is applied when the muscle is stretched and the least when it's shortened. Next, let's look at the press. Shoulder and overhead presses target the anterior deltoid and don't adequately stimulate the lateral deltoid. Therefore, it's not ideal to only do presses for shoulder workouts. It's better to also stimulate the lateral deltoid with raises. The anterior deltoid is already heavily stimulated during chest exercises like the bench press, so I believe you don't need too many extra anterior deltoid exercises from vertical presses. If you want to stimulate the lateral deltoid more with a press, you can change your arm position when you do it. When your arms are in front, the anterior deltoid is stimulated more, but as they move back, lateral deltoid activation increases. A study published in 2022 compared the front press and the behind-the-neck press using both a machine and a barbell. In other words, it compared the barbell front press and behind-the-neck press with the machine front press and behind-the-neck press. All 4 exercises showed similar anterior deltoid EMG activity. However, for the lateral deltoid, the behind-the-neck press with a barbell showed overwhelmingly higher activation. EMG data indicates muscle activation, so it doesn't perfectly predict muscle hypertrophy. But it can be an indicator that gives a rough picture of when and how much a muscle is used, and we can clearly see that the behind-the-neck press is advantageous for lateral deltoid activation. Now let's move on to the disadvantages of the press. Whole body exercises like the overhead press cause significant systemic fatigue. Fatigue is categorized as local or systemic. You can think of local fatigue as the strain on the specific muscle and nearby joints you're working, while systemic fatigue is the overall stress on your entire body, regardless of the area being exercised. Overhead presses don't just work your shoulders, your core and lower body are also engaged, leading to significant full body strain and considerable systemic fatigue. Just a few sets of overhead press can tire out your whole body, which affects the performance of the exercises you do afterward. Conversely, consider isolation exercises like lateral raises with less fatigue. Even after 10 sets, you don't accumulate that much systemic fatigue, so you can perform comparatively more volume with less impact on subsequent exercises. Another downside of the overhead press is that the movement is unstable. Because you're lifting a free weight barbell overhead, it's not easy to stabilize the swaying weight. Generally, the more unstable a movement is, the less effectively your muscles can work, resulting in an inferior exercise. Let's compare doing squats on a perfectly flat surface versus doing them on a wobbly table. In which scenario can you lift more heavy weight? It's clearly on the flat floor. If a movement is stable, you can generate more force, but if it's unstable, it's difficult to generate strong force. Of course, if you've been working out for a long time and have 100% mastered the overhead press technique, you don't need to worry so much about stability. But for beginners or intermediates, a lack of technique can lead to instability, negatively affecting the force you can generate and ultimately muscle hypertrophy. So how can we compensate for the drawbacks of the overhead press? First, let's sit down instead of standing. If you set up an incline bench and lean your back against it, you use your lower body less, and since there's support for your back, you also use your core less. This can reduce the systemic fatigue you generate. Also, instead of using a barbell, let's try using a Smith machine. A barbell, being free weight, can wobble and feel unstable. However, a Smith machine's fixed movement path eliminates the need for additional effort to stabilize the weight. This enables 100% power generation, training your deltoid to its limit. Now let's examine the posterior deltoid. The posterior deltoid gets stimulated to some extent just from pulling row movements, but it's still good to add about 1 isolation exercise. A study by Dr. Button compared posterior deltoid activation across various exercises. As you can see, the isolation exercise, the reverse pec deck fly, showed far superior posterior deltoid activation than multi-joint exercises like the lat pull down or seated row. EMG doesn't perfectly predict muscle hypertrophy, yet we see the reverse pec deck fly stimulates the posterior deltoid well. Dr. Brett Contreras also emphasizes that exercises that isolate the posterior deltoid lead to much more muscle activation than multi-joint exercises like the row. So besides multi-joint pulling exercises like rows, pull-downs, and pull-ups, it's good to add at least 1 posterior deltoid isolation movement to your routine. This client here has abnormally well-developed posterior deltoids compared to his other muscles, and it turns out he does the reverse pec deck almost every day. That must be why his posterior deltoids are so well-developed. Besides pulling the arm back, the posterior deltoid has another function called shoulder external rotation. So exercises involving both shoulder horizontal extension and shoulder external rotation are also excellent for stimulating the posterior deltoid, like the face pull. Grabbing and pulling the rope will perform shoulder horizontal extension and external rotation. At the end of the movement, think of hitting a front double biceps pose and squeeze the posterior deltoid all the way. Some people don't like isolation exercises and just want to do rows. To strongly stimulate the posterior deltoid with just one row, follow these steps. First, move only your arms, keeping your scapula as still as possible. Since the posterior deltoid is only involved in the movement of the upper arm, you need to pull with the idea of sending your arm behind your torso. If your scapula moves, other back muscles, not just the posterior deltoid, will engage, making the movement inefficient. Also, the posterior deltoid is best stimulated when maintaining a 35 to 45 degree angle between your upper arm and torso. Due to the range of motion, the posterior deltoid pulls the upper arm behind the torso. At this point, you can squeeze the posterior deltoid the most at the angle where the upper arm can move furthest behind the torso, which maximizes the range of motion. Because this angle varies for each person, please extend your arms to 90 degrees and then slowly lower them to find the angle where your arms can move furthest backward. Then, with arms spread to that angle, row by pulling with only your arms, no scapular movement, to stimulate your posterior deltoid. We are now selling the Teach a Man to Fish, the A to Z bodybuilding guide, the same material we use for coaching our clients that has received the best feedback. You know the saying, give a hungry man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. We created this guide with the goal of providing the knowledge and know-how to help you train on your own. It truly contains all the bodybuilding knowledge you'll ever need. It references over 80 research papers and all the content is evidence-based. This one guide will cover the content of all the YouTube videos we'll upload in the future. If you find it bothersome to look up every single video, you can wrap it all up at once with this one book. The trial version link is in the pinned comment. Feel free to read it if interested. Thank you.